While more intense and lethal than the famous gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, the shootout in Ingalls, Oklahoma, between the Doolin Dalton gang and U.S. deputy marshals remains relatively obscure. In the early 1890s, one of the hideouts frequently utilized by the Doolin Dalton gang was the modest community of Ingalls, Oklahoma. Unfortunately, this small town had become a sanctuary for numerous outlaws, tolerated by the local residents due to their lavish spending habits. In return, these lawbreakers kept their behavior in check to protect their hideout. During August 1893, various members of the outlaw gang, including Bill Doolin, Bill Dalton, George Redbuck Waitman, George Bitter Creek, Newcomb, Charlie Pierce, Arkansas Tom Jones, Tulsa Jack Blake, and Dynamite Dick Clifton, sought refuge in this unassuming town. Most of them had been staying in Ingalls for weeks, residing at the city hotel and frequenting the Ransom Saloon. Upon learning of their whereabouts, U.S. Marshal Yvette Dumas, E.D. Nix assembled a posse comprising approximately 27 deputy marshals and Indian police and set out for Ingalls. They camped along a creek the previous night, a location spotted by a young boy who was subsequently held overnight by the deputies. However, the boy managed to slip away early the following morning and rushed into Ingalls with a dire warning for the outlaws. The marshals are on their way. Thanks to the boy's alert, the outlaws had time to prepare their horses at the livery stable. However, instead of making a hasty getaway, they opted to return to their poker game at the saloon. On the morning of September 1st, 1893, the posse stealthily entered town while the outlaws were engrossed in their drinking and gambling inside the saloon. When Newcomb exited the establishment and mounted his horse, he came under fire from one of the officers. However, Arkansas Tom Jones, who was ailing in bed at the OK Hotel, retaliated from his second-story window, inflicting a fatal wound on U.S. Deputy Marshal Thomas Houston, who would succumb to his injuries the following day. After discharging just a few rounds, Newcomb sustained injuries but managed to evade capture. In a matter of seconds, an all-out shootout erupted, with the outlaws blazing their guns as they made their way from the saloon to the nearby livery stable. Fleeing outlaws Redbuck, Bill Dalton, and Tulsa Jack Blake swiftly mounted their horses and emerged from the stable, firing their weapons. Deputy Lafayette Shadley aimed at Bill Dalton, but mistakenly struck the outlaw's horse, causing Dalton to tumble to the ground. In retaliation, Dalton opened fire, hitting Shadley, who would succumb to his wounds 2 days later. Meanwhile, Bill Doolin fatally shot Deputy Marshal Richard Speed. Outlaws Dan, Dynamite Dick Clifton, and Charlie Pierce were also hit and injured, but remained capable of riding. All the outlaws managed to escape except for Arkansas Tom Jones, who found himself trapped in a hotel room. Deputy Marshal Jim Masterson threatened to throw dynamite into Jones's hiding spot. Although there was talk of lynching Arkansas Tom Jones, he was eventually transported to a federal prison in Guthrie, Oklahoma Territory. During the chaos of the shootout, an innocent bystander named Young Simmons lost his life when he sought refuge inside Vaughn's saloon. On September 1st, 1893, a group of U.S. deputy marshals dispatched by me to pursue these outlaws arrived near Ingalls. The outlaws we're talking about were present in the town at that time, specifically inside Ransom's saloon where a man named Murray was employed. True to form, the outlaws had received advance notice of the approaching deputies, and they dispatched a messenger to the lawmen, inviting them to enter the town if they believed they could apprehend them. The deputies accepted the invitation and, after organizing their positions, sent a messenger to the outlaws, requesting their surrender. In response, they were met with gunfire from Winchester rifles. One of the outlaws, known as Bitter Creek, rushed out of the mentioned saloon and fired a shot towards the north, where some of the deputies were stationed. He then turned around and was met with return fire from the deputies. This return fire damaged the magazine of his Winchester and inflicted a thigh wound. Concurrently, the remaining outlaws inside the saloon directed a heavy barrage of gunfire at the deputies, who in turn opened fire, causing substantial damage to the saloon. Additionally, one of the horses, tethered in front of the saloon, was shot and killed by the deputies. With the deputies' fire intensifying and becoming increasingly perilous for the outlaws, they decided to make their escape through a side exit and sought refuge in a sizable stable. This man Murray, who worked at the saloon, appeared at the saloon's front door either just before the outlaws left the building or immediately after. It is uncertain. However, when he initially emerged in the doorway, he had the door partially open and aimed his Winchester rifle, poised to fire. This occurred before the deputies were aware that the outlaws had exited the premises. 3 of the deputies simultaneously fired at Murray upon observing him in that position. Their shots hit him, causing injuries to his ribs and breaking his arm in 2 places. Another local resident, known simply as Old Man Ramson, suffered a leg injury but survived. The saloon bartender, Mr. Murray, an associate of the outlaw gang, also sustained wounds. He had fired at the deputies from his front door, getting hit in the ribs and arm. Murray was apprehended and subsequently sent to prison. 2 years after his release, Murray pursued compensation from the government for his injuries, but lost his case, with U.S. Marshal Nix providing testimony to support his deputy marshal's actions. In the end, the outlaws may have claimed victory in the battle, but they ultimately lost the war. Over time, every member of the gang who had managed to escape from the confrontation in Ingalls would meet their demise, with most falling at the hands of U.S. deputy marshals. Ingalls, Oklahoma, positioned approximately midway between Stillwater and Yale, Oklahoma, has vanished from state highway maps. Today, the location is marked solely by a handful of abandoned structures, stone foundations, and a stone memorial commemorating the site of the renowned gunfight. Established in the aftermath of the 1889 land rush into the unassigned lands between the Chickasaw Nation to the south and the Cherokee Outlet to the north, Ingalls thrived as a community of 150 residents during the 1890s. However, by 1907, the post office had shut down. The site can be found approximately 9 miles east of Stillwater, Oklahoma, and 1 mile south along Ingalls Road. U.S. Marshal Yvette Dumas, EED. Nick's account of the battle, as written in a letter to Attorney General Judson Harmon on July 30, 1895. One George Ransom owned a saloon in the town of Ingalls, and this man Murray worked for him as a bartender. The outlaws Bill Doolin, Bitter Creek, Tulsa Jack, Dynamite Dick, Red Buck, Tom Jones, and numerous others made this saloon their headquarters, and Ransom, Murray, and other citizens catered to their trade, carried the news of the movements of the deputy marshals, furnished them with ammunition, cared for their horses, permitted them to eat at their tables and sleep in their beds. These facts were well known to the community, although a conviction on the charge of harboring or aiding and abetting criminals against the laws of the United States could never be sustained by reason of the fact that the entire community was under duress and would not testify for fear of losing their lives and property. 8 or 10 horses were killed and 9 persons killed and wounded. 1 deputy was killed outright at the first fire, and 2 more died the next day. 3 outlaws were wounded and 1 captured. The 1 captured was afterwards sentenced to 50 years in the penitentiary and is now serving his time. Very respectfully, E.D. Nix, U.S. Marshal,